The envelope trembled in George Foreman's weathered hands. His eyes, once sharp enough to track the fastest punches in boxing history, now squinted at the yellowed paper. The postmark read, Louisville, Kentucky, dated 3 weeks before Muhammad Ali's death. Foreman's heart pounded against his ribs like it hadn't since that humid night in Zaire, 51 years ago. "George, you need to read this," his wife had said, handing him the letter that arrived mysteriously this morning. "It's from Ali." The kitchen around him faded away. For a moment he was back in that ring in Kinshasa, the crowd chanting, "Ali Bomaye! Ali, kill him." The memory still stung. But they'd become friends later, hadn't they? What could Ali possibly need to confess after all these years? Foreman broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakable, even with the tremors of Parkinson's evident in each stroke. "George, my brother," it began. "By the time you read this, I'll be gone. There's something I've carried for almost 5 decades. Something about that night in Zaire. Something that will change everything you thought you knew about the rumble in the jungle." The phone rang. Foreman ignored it. Outside, a neighbor's lawnmower roared to life, but Foreman couldn't hear it. His world had narrowed to the words on the page before him. Words that threatened to unravel the foundation of boxing history and his own legacy. "What I'm about to tell you," the letter continued, "I've never told another soul." 6 months earlier, Muhammad Ali sat alone in his study in Scottsdale, Arizona. The desert sun cast long shadows across the room as he hunched over his desk, his once nimble fingers struggling with the pen. The medication helped with the tremors, but writing remained difficult, especially today, when each word carried the weight of decades. "You sure about this, champ?" Angelo Dundee's voice came from the doorway. Even at 94, Ali's longtime trainer still had the same concerned look he'd worn in Ali's corner for countless fights. Ali looked up, his eyes still carrying that mischievous spark that had charmed the world. "Got to do it, Angie," he said, his voice a whisper of its former booming self. "Time's running out." Angelo nodded, understanding the gravity of what Ali was doing. "You two made peace years ago. Is this really necessary?" Ali's gaze drifted to the photographs lining his wall. Images of a younger, stronger version of himself, dancing around opponents, predicting rounds, shocking the world. His eyes lingered on one photo, him standing over a fallen Foreman in Zaire, the night everything changed. "Some peace is built on lies," Ali replied softly. "That ain't real peace." Angelo crossed the room and placed a hand on Ali's shoulder. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. Always have been." Ali nodded and returned to his letter. Outside, the sound of children playing basketball drifted through the window, their laughter and trash talk reminding him of his own youth in Louisville, before he became Cassius Clay, before he became Muhammad Ali, before he became the greatest. As Angelo left, Ali's mind wandered back to that night in 1974, the humid air of Kinshasa, the electricity of 80,000 voices, the fear he'd never admitted to anyone, not even himself. Until now. He looked down at what he'd written so far. Was he really going to do this? Reveal the truth that could potentially tarnish his legacy? The confession that had burdened him for decades? His hand trembled as he pressed the pen back to paper. "George," he wrote, "what happened that night wasn't what everyone thinks." Meanwhile, across the country, George Foreman was preparing for another day of interviews promoting his latest autobiography. At 77, he'd successfully reinvented himself multiple times. From the scowling Olympic gold medalist to the fearsome world champion, to the smiling pitchman selling grills, to an elder statesman of boxing. "10 minutes, Mr. Foreman," called the young production assistant through his dressing room door. George adjusted his tie in the mirror, a ritual he'd performed thousands of times. But today, something felt different. A strange premonition hung in the air like the electricity before a thunderstorm. His phone buzzed with a text from his son. "Dad, just saw on the news Ali's not doing well. Might want to reach out." George stared at the message. He and Ali had been friendly for years, making joint appearances, sharing laughs about their infamous fight. But there had always been something unspoken between them. A question George never had the courage to ask. "Why did you really beat me that night?" George tucked the phone away. Maybe after this interview, he'd call Muhammad. After all these years, maybe it was finally time for the real conversation they'd both been avoiding. Neither man knew that fate was already in motion, that the truth hidden for 5 decades was finally about to come to light. CNN breaking news, boxing legend, Muhammad Ali has passed away at the age of 74 after a long battle with Parkinson's disease. George Foreman sat motionless in his Houston living room, the television's glow illuminating the tears on his face. It was strange how grief could physically hurt, a heavyweight punch to the solar plexus that left you gasping. "I should have called him," George whispered to the empty room. The regret tasted bitter in his mouth. His wife placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You two made peace long ago, George. He knew how you felt." Did he, though? George wondered. They'd shared stages, done interviews together, embraced for the cameras. But had they ever truly spoken about that night? About how a defeat had broken one man and cemented the other's immortality? The next morning, George's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Everyone wanted a quote, a memory, a piece of his relationship with Ali for their tributes and retrospectives. To CNN, "He was not just my opponent, but my brother." To ESPN, "The world lost its greatest fighter, but heaven gained its loudest poet." To the New York Times, "Muhammad changed me more in one night than most people change in a lifetime." All true, but none of it was the whole truth. After the 20th call, George turned his phone off and retreated to his home gym. At 77, he still maintained a rigorous workout routine. The familiar rhythm of the heavy bag usually cleared his mind, but today the thud-thud-thud only reminded him of heartbeats stilled. As his fists connected with the leather, George's mind wandered back to Zaire, the stifling heat, the deafening crowd, the rope-a-dope strategy that had drained him, the punches that seemed to come from nowhere in the 8th round. He'd replayed that fight in his mind thousands of times over the years, analyzed every mistake, every missed opportunity, but there had always been something that didn't add up. Something in Ali's eyes when they'd met in the center of the ring before the knockdown. A look George had never been able to decipher. 3 weeks later, as the world continued to mourn Ali, George was invited to be a pallbearer at the funeral. Standing beside the casket, surrounded by other boxing greats and celebrities, George felt a strange peace. Whatever questions remained unanswered between them would stay that way now. Or so he thought. After the service, a slight man in a sharp suit approached him. "Mr. Foreman," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Robert Harper, Muhammad's attorney." George shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip. "Nice to meet you, though I wish it were under different circumstances." Harper nodded solemnly. "Indeed, Mr. Ali left specific instructions for me regarding certain matters. One concerns you." He reached into his jacket and produced a business card. "When you're ready, and only when you're ready, please call this number. There's something Muhammad wanted you to have." George took the card, confusion furrowing his brow. "What is it?" "I'm afraid I can't say more." Those were his instructions. Harper's expression softened. "He said you'd understand when the time came." For 3 months, that business card sat in George's wallet. Sometimes he'd take it out late at night, stare at the embossed letters, then return it to its place. Not yet. He wasn't ready yet. Then came the dreams. 3 nights in a row, he dreamed of Ali, not the trembling man weakened by disease, but the vibrant fighter who taunted and tormented him. In each dream, Ali was trying to tell him something, but George couldn't hear the words. On the 4th morning, George called the number. 2 days later, a courier delivered a small package to his door. Inside was a sealed envelope with his name written in a shaky hand. Now sitting at his kitchen table, George stared at Ali's confession. The words swam before his eyes, their implications too enormous to process. If what Ali was saying was true, everything would change. That night in Zaire, Ali had written, "I was scared, George. More scared than I've ever been." The world spun around George Foreman as he read further into Ali's letter. The kitchen chair creaked beneath him as he leaned closer to the yellowed paper, as if proximity might somehow make the words less shocking. "The doctors found something before our fight," Ali's letter continued. "A shadow on the scan. They couldn't be sure without more tests, but they warned me it could be serious. Maybe career-ending. I kept it quiet. Not even Angelo knew at first." George's breath caught in his throat. A medical issue? Before their fight? He read on, Ali's handwritten words becoming more urgent. "I shouldn't have been in that ring, George, but I couldn't back out. Not with all those people counting on me. Not with all I'd said. The world needed to believe a man could do the impossible. So I fought anyway, carrying a secret that terrified me more than your punches ever could." Outside, thunder rumbled across the Texas sky, a summer storm brewing. It seemed fitting somehow. The morning of the fight, I got more news. The new test showed it wasn't what they feared. I was going to be okay. That relief, that pure, overwhelming joy, gave me something that night that even your power couldn't match. I wasn't just fighting for a title. I was fighting with the reborn freedom of a man who'd stared death in the face and survived. George lowered the letter, his mind racing back through the decades. He remembered Ali's eyes that night, not just confident but almost transcendent. At the time, George had attributed it to Ali's usual bravado. Now he understood it was something much deeper. He continued reading, Ali's confession unfolding like a novel he couldn't put down. But that's not what's haunted me all these years, George. What's haunted me is what I learned later about the people around that fight, about the money, about the deals, about what they were willing to do to make sure Africa's first heavyweight championship fight delivered the story they wanted. George's hands began to shake. Was Ali suggesting what he thought he was? 3 years after we fought, a man approached me in Chicago. He'd been part of Mobutu's inner circle. He told me they'd tampered with your water bottles between rounds. Started with the 5th round when they saw I might actually have a chance. Not enough to drug you completely, but enough to dull your senses, slow your reactions. By the 8th round, you weren't the same fighter who'd started the bout. The letter slipped from George's fingers, floating to the floor like a fallen leaf. His mind reeled with denial, then anger, then a strange, hollow acceptance. It would explain so much. The inexplicable fatigue that had overtaken him. The way his deadly right hand had suddenly lost its timing. He picked up the letter again, forcing himself to continue. I didn't believe him at first, George. Didn't want to believe him. But he had details, photographs, names. Over the years, I found more evidence, spoke to others who confirmed parts of his story. I've included it all with this letter. You deserve to know. The world deserves to know. George glanced at the envelope again, noticing for the first time that it was thicker than it should be for just a letter. Inside was a smaller envelope labeled, Evidence. I've carried this burden for too long, Ali's letter continued. At first I told myself it didn't matter, that I was winning that fight anyway, that the better man had prevailed. But as the years passed, as you and I became friends, the lie grew heavier. You deserved better, George. The sport deserved better. Thunder cracked outside, closer now. Rain began to patter against the windows, a gentle counterpoint to the storm raging inside George's mind. I'm asking your forgiveness, but more than that, I'm asking for your help. Together, we can set the record straight. Not to change the outcome, what's done is done, but to honor the truth, to honor boxing, to honor what you and I both gave to that ring. The final paragraph of the letter was written in a shakier hand, as if Ali had struggled particularly to form these words. I don't know how much time I have left, George. This disease takes more of me each day. But I know I can't take this secret to my grave. You were always the stronger man in body and, I suspect, in character too. I'm trusting you to do what's right with this information. Whatever you decide, know that I've always respected you, even when I was pretending not to. You're the only man who ever truly scared Muhammad Ali, and for that alone you deserved better than what happened in Zaire. It was signed simply, Muhammad. George sat motionless at the kitchen table, the letter limp in his hands, rain now beating against the windows. The revelation should have been vindicating, proof that his defeat had been tainted, that history had been altered by forces beyond the ring. Yet instead of satisfaction, he felt only a profound sadness. If what Ali claimed was true, they had both been victims that night in Kinshasa. George reached for the second envelope, the one marked Evidence, then stopped, his hand hovering in midair. Did he really want to know? Did he want to see photographs, read testimonies, confirm what Ali had claimed? Would it change anything after all these years? The boxing world still revered the rumble in the jungle as one of the greatest fights in history. Ali's victory was the stuff of legend, the triumph of wit over power, of resilience over dominance. To challenge that narrative now would affect not just George's legacy or Ali's, but the sport itself. Outside, lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the room. In that moment of clarity, George made his decision. He picked up the evidence envelope, weighing it in his hands. Whatever choice he made would change everything. Again. 6 weeks later, George Foreman stood at a podium in the International Boxing Hall of Fame in Canastota, New York. Camera flashes popped like lightning strikes around him. Reporters from every major sports outlet in the world sat in hushed anticipation. The press conference had been announced with little explanation, only that George Foreman would be making an important statement regarding Muhammad Ali and the rumble in the jungle. Speculation had run wild. Some predicted George would challenge the fight's result after 5 decades. Others thought he might reveal some previously unknown aspect of their rivalry. Nobody knew about the letter. Nobody knew about the evidence. Nobody except George himself. He adjusted the microphone, looking out at the sea of expectant faces. Among them, he recognized boxing journalists who'd covered him for decades, current champions who'd grown up idolizing both him and Ali, and in the front row, members of Ali's family, including his widow Lonnie and daughter Layla, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern. George had spent weeks verifying Ali's claims, consulting with forensic experts, tracking down witnesses. The evidence was compelling, if not conclusive, enough to cast doubt, enough to rewrite history, enough to forever change how the world remembered that historic night in Africa. "Thank you all for coming," George began, his deep voice filling the room. "As you know, Muhammad Ali and I shared a special bond, one forged in the heat of competition and tempered by the passing years. Our fight in Zaire was more than just a boxing match. It was a cultural moment that transcended sport." He paused, feeling the weight of his next words. "Shortly before his death, Muhammad sent me a letter, a private correspondence between two warriors who respected each other deeply, despite what we might have said for the cameras." A small smile crossed George's face at this, drawing a gentle laugh from the audience who remembered Ali's relentless taunting. "In that letter, Muhammad shared something with me that he'd carried for many years, something that troubled him deeply, something about that night in Kinshasa." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Reporters leaned forward in their seats. Camera operators adjusted their focus. George reached into his jacket pocket and removed Ali's letter, now carefully preserved in a protective sleeve. He looked at it for a long moment, then set it on the podium before him. "Muhammad believed that there were irregularities surrounding our fight. Specifically, he had evidence suggesting that my water might have been tampered with during the later rounds." The room erupted. Journalists shouted questions. Cameras clicked frantically. George raised his hands, calling for quiet. He provided documentation supporting these claims: names, dates, photographs, testimony from individuals connected to the Mobutu regime. "Over the past weeks, I've had experts analyze this evidence." George paused, looking directly at Ali's family in the front row. Lonnie's eyes were wide, but her expression was unreadable. Layla looked stunned. "The evidence suggests there may be truth to what Muhammad believed. There are indications that certain individuals, operating without the knowledge of either fighter or our immediate teams, may have sought to influence the outcome of the bout." Another wave of noise swept the room. George again waited for quiet before continuing. "Now, I stand before you today with a choice. I could use this information to challenge the official result of that fight. I could demand an asterisk be placed next to Muhammad Ali's victory in the record books. I could seek to change how history remembers that night." The room had gone completely silent now. Even the camera shutters seemed to pause. George straightened his shoulders, standing tall like the formidable champion he'd once been. "But that is not why I'm here today." Confusion crossed many faces in the audience. "Muhammad Ali sent me this information not to excuse his victory or diminish his achievement, but because the truth mattered to him, even a truth that complicated his greatest triumph. That's the kind of man he was, that's why the world loved him." George's voice grew stronger, more resolute. "I've decided that the official result of the rumble in the jungle will remain unchanged. Muhammad Ali won that fight, period. Whatever may or may not have happened with water bottles or outside interference, nothing can diminish what he accomplished that night. His courage, his strategy, his heart, those were real. Those were earned." A collective breath seemed to release from the room. Lonnie Ali closed her eyes briefly, her hand finding Layla's. "Instead," George continued, "I want to use this moment to announce the establishment of the Ali Foreman Clean Boxing Initiative, using funds that Muhammad set aside before his death, supplemented by my own contribution. This program will work to eliminate corruption and performance-enhancing drugs from boxing at all levels, from local gyms to world championship fights." Approving nods spread throughout the audience. "Muhammad and I both loved this sport. We gave our blood, sweat, and years of our lives to it. We owe it to future generations of fighters to ensure they compete on a level playing field, judged solely on their skill, heart, and preparation. George looked down at Ali's letter one last time. Muhammad's final wish was not to rewrite history, but to improve the future. Not to claim vindication, but to seek redemption. For himself, for me, for boxing itself. I can think of no better way to honor his memory than to take this painful truth and transform it into something positive. Tears glistened in George's eyes now, but his voice remained strong. In his letter, Muhammad wrote that he believed I was the stronger man, in body and in character. Today, I hope to prove him half right, because the strength he showed in confessing this burden to me, in trusting me with this truth, that was the strength of a truly great man. The greatest, in fact. George stepped back from the podium as applause filled the room. Journalists rose to their feet. Even hardened boxing veterans were wiping away tears. As the press conference concluded, Lonnie Ali approached George. Without a word, she embraced him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered in his ear. He would be proud. Later that evening, alone in his hotel room, George sat on the edge of the bed and looked out at the New York skyline. The weight he'd carried since receiving Ali's letter had lifted. In its place was a strange peace, not the vindication he might once have craved, but something more valuable. He opened the hotel room's small safe and removed the envelope marked evidence. He hadn't shown these materials at the press conference. Nobody but him had seen them. Nobody but him ever would. George crossed to the wastebasket and dropped the envelope inside. Then, taking the hotel matchbook, he struck a match and watched as the flame caught the paper's edge. As the evidence burned away, George thought he could almost hear Ali's voice, that unmistakable lyrical taunt that had once infuriated him and later made him laugh. "I told you I was the greatest, George." For the first time since receiving the letter, George Foreman smiled. "Yes, Muhammad," he whispered to the empty room. "Yes, you were." Outside, the New York night sparkled with possibilities. Tomorrow, the headlines would announce the Ali Foreman Clean Boxing Initiative. Sports networks would debate the revelations about Zaire. Conspiracy theorists would have a field day. But none of that mattered now. Two warriors who had once tried to destroy each other in the ring had, in the end, saved each other's legacies. The fight that had defined them both would remain legendary, not despite the shadow that had fallen across it, but because they had together stepped into the light. George turned away from the burning evidence and picked up his phone. He had calls to make, a program to build, a promise to keep. The truth had finally set them both free.